In 1995, on a lonely Arizona highway, an entire class of 22 Catholic schoolgirls and their nun chaperone vanished from their bus. No blood, no struggle, just silence. 7 years later, in 2002, a new cargo X-ray at the Nogales border caught 8 ghostly silhouettes crammed in a hidden truck compartment. The same girls, now teens, alive, but shattered. This wasn't a cold case. It was a crime that never stopped. One mother, Elena Morales, risked everything to find her daughter Gabriela, facing corruption, cartels, and the dark heart of Honduras. Thought for 20s, the disappearance of an entire Catholic girls' class and their chaperone in 1995 became one of Arizona's most haunting cold cases. The initial investigation dead-ended on a deserted stretch of highway where all traces of them simply vanished. After 7 years with no leads, the file was buried under the weight of time. But in 2002, a newly installed cargo X-ray scanner at the Nogales port of entry saw something that human eyes could not. Ghost-like silhouettes of multiple figures materialized on the screen, huddled inside a hidden compartment. The image would prove the 1995 disappearance was not a cold case, but an ongoing crime that had never stopped. The scent of old cigarette smoke and chronic failure permeated Barry Nussbaum's Tucson office, a smell Elena Morales had come to associate with the suffocating weight of the past 7 years. It was October 2002, and the world had moved on. But Elena remained anchored to a single sun-drenched afternoon in 1995, when the first grade class of St. Margaret's Academy for Girls had simply ceased to exist. "Barry, this is useless," Elena said, the edge in her voice honed by countless similar conversations. She tapped a manila folder resting atop the precarious stacks of paper covering his desk. Inside were grainy, long-distance photographs of a market in Mexico City. Images so vague they could have been anyone, anywhere. You promised a tangible lead on the Coyote network. "This is just more smoke." Nussbaum leaned back, the faux leather chair protesting under his weight. He was a man whose investigative zeal had long ago surrendered to the ease of billing desperate clients. "Elena, I'm tracing the funds, but the trail evaporates south of the border. These aren't people who leave digital footprints. It's a ghost network." "A ghost network? You charge me $5,000 to investigate?" she retorted. The confined space of the office felt suddenly too small. She stood and began to pace, moving past the framed certifications that seemed to mock her with their impotence. Not one of those documents had brought her closer to Gabriela, her daughter, or any of the other 21 missing girls. She stopped at the window, staring out at the heat shimmering off the asphalt parking lot. She knew the reflection Nussbaum saw. A woman hollowed out by grief, sustained only by an obsession that made her an easy mark. Perhaps he was right, but that obsession was the scaffolding holding her life together. "I've given you every file, every theory the police discarded, every rumor whispered in the border towns," she said, turning back to face him. The weariness momentarily eclipsed by anger. The bus was found on Route 82 empty. No blood, no struggle, just silence. 22 6-year-olds and Sister Magdalena don't just vanish. Someone saw something. Someone always knows. "And I'm telling you," Nussbaum sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose, "that someone is likely dead or very, very rich. The initial police work was a disaster. We know this. The border was wide open in 95. They could be anywhere." He paused, then delivered the familiar blow with casual indifference. "Or nowhere." The cruelty of his apathy ignited a familiar rage. "Don't you dare," she whispered, the threat vibrating in the small room. The frustration finally boiled over, and she slammed her hand against the desk, rattling a lukewarm cup of coffee. "I need more than excuses. I need the sharp electronic trill of her cell phone sliced through the tension." Elena flinched, her heart executing the same painful leap it always did when an unknown number flashed on the screen. She didn't recognize the ID. "Morales," she answered, her voice clipped, her eyes locking briefly with Nussbaum's, who suddenly looked interested. "Mrs. Morales, this is Special Agent Marcus Thorne with the Federal Bureau of Investigation." The air left the room. The FBI had relegated the St. Margaret's disappearance to the cold case files years ago, buried under the weight of time and fresher tragedies. "Yes, we need you to come down to Nogales immediately." Thorne's voice was professional, measured. Yet beneath the calm surface, Elena detected an undercurrent of urgency she hadn't heard from law enforcement in half a decade. "Nogales, why? What's happened?" There was a fractional pause on the line. "There's been a development near the checkpoint. A discovery? We have several young women in custody." Elena's breath hitched. "Young women? Gabriella would be 13 now. Did you find them? Is Gabriella there?" "We can't confirm any identities yet," Mrs. Morales, Thorne said, his voice carefully neutral. "But given the circumstances of the discovery, we believe there may be a connection to the 1995 incident." "How quickly can you get here?" Elena was already moving, snatching her keys from her purse before the words had fully registered. "I'm leaving now." She hung up and glanced at Nussbaum, who was watching her with a mixture of surprise and predatory interest. "They found something," she said, the words feeling heavy and strange on her tongue. "Well, I'll be damned," Nussbaum muttered. "Maybe I should accompany you. Offer my consultation services." "No." Elena cut him off. The finality of her tone was absolute. She pulled a checkbook from her purse, scribbled a final payment with a trembling hand, and tossed it onto the desk. "We're done, Barry." She walked out of the office, leaving the smoke and the stagnation behind. The drive south from Tucson was a blur of saguaro cacti standing sentinel against the harsh desert landscape. Elena gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. Hope, that dangerous, treacherous emotion she had fought to suppress for years, was surging through her, battling with the skepticism hardened by countless disappointments. She reached into the glove compartment, her fingers finding the familiar worn edges of the photograph. It was the class photo of St. Margaret's first grade taken just a week before the field trip. The colors were slightly faded, the image creased from years of handling. 22 little girls arrayed in brown and white plaid uniforms, crisp white collars, and neat red bows. Smiling faces, missing teeth, a tapestry of innocence. Her eyes immediately found Gabriella. Front row second from the left. Dark hair, bright eyes, a smile that hinted at a shy secret. Flanking the children were the two nuns, their habits stark against the red velvet curtain backdrop. A discovery. Young women. Elena pressed her foot down on the accelerator, the desert landscape rushing past as she raced toward the border, toward the terrifying possibility that the agonizing silence of 7 years was finally about to break. Hours earlier, the air at the U.S. Border Patrol checkpoint on Interstate 19, just north of Nogales, shimmered with the heat of exhaust fumes and the monotonous rhythm of cross-border commerce. It was a rhythm agent Marcus Thorne had internalized during his 2 years stationed in the southwest border region. Technology had fundamentally altered the landscape of interdiction. Thorne, having reviewed the cold case files from the 1990s, knew that era had been defined by porous borders and rudimentary detection methods. But this was 2002. A surge in funding had brought advanced tools to the front line, most notably the new Z-Portal vehicle and cargo inspection system. It was this system, a massive structure that scanned vehicles as they passed through, that flagged the produce truck. The driver, Hector Villalobos, had been sweating profusely, a stark contrast to the air-conditioned chill of his cab. His manifest listed a routine cargo of tomatoes and squash, yet his hands had trembled visibly as he surrendered his paperwork to the primary inspection officer. The truck was directed through this portal. Thorne, alerted by the checkpoint supervisor due to the driver's anomalous behavior, monitored the imaging screen in the control booth as the scan progressed. The image materialized in real time, rendered in stark, monochromatic blue tones. It was an X-ray view, peeling back the metal skin of the truck to reveal the contents within. The cab appeared first, empty, then the trailer. The corrugated texture of the container walls was visible, followed by the densely packed shapes of the cargo, crates stacked high, creating a mosaic of agricultural produce. And then the anomalies appeared. "Hold the image," Thorne ordered, leaning closer to the screen, his focus narrowing. In the center of the trailer, nestled among the crates, were shapes that defied the neat geometry of the cargo. They were organic, too large, too distinct. Silhouettes, ghost-like and ethereal against the stark background, 8 figures huddled together. They were facing away from the scanner, their bodies elongated. What struck Thorne most profoundly was the hair. Long, straight masses trailing down their backs, appearing as solid white forms in the high-contrast image. We have multiple UDAs, the technician stated, the clinical term for undocumented aliens sounding inadequate for what they were seeing. No, Thorne murmured, a cold dread tightening in his gut. This is different. The way they were positioned, the uniformity of their appearance suggested something organized, something deeply sinister. This is Trafficking. He keyed his radio, his voice crisp and authoritative. Supervisor, this is Thorne. Tactical response at the Z portal. Secure the driver. We have at least 8 individuals in a hidden compartment. The atmosphere at the checkpoint shifted instantly. The routine flow of traffic ground to a halt. Alarms sounded. Gates slammed down. The tactical team, heavily armed and armored, converged on the produce truck. Thorne exited the control booth and approached the scene, the desert sun beating down on him. His hand resting instinctively on his sidearm. The driver, Villalobos, was already in handcuffs, protesting loudly in Spanish, his face pale with terror. Where's the access point? Thorne demanded, examining the rear of the trailer. The locks were heavy-duty, standard issue, but the metal around the doorframe showed subtle signs of modification. A weld that wasn't factory standard cut it. The grinding screech of the hydraulic spreader against metal filled the air. Sparks flew as the team breached the doors. Thorne raised his weapon, anticipating resistance, the possibility of armed smugglers hidden within the cargo. The doors swung open. The smell that erupted from the trailer was overwhelming. A potent, suffocating mix of rotting produce, sweat, and human waste. Inside, the front section of the trailer was indeed packed with crates of tomatoes and squash. But behind a false wall, hastily constructed from plywood, was the hidden compartment. It was cramped, airless, and dark, and within it the 8 figures from the X-ray. They weren't men seeking work. They were girls, teenagers. They huddled together, blinking against the sudden violent intrusion of the desert sun. They were malnourished, their clothing ragged and filthy, their hair, long and matted, obscured their faces. They were utterly silent. Get medical personnel here now. Thorne barked into his radio, lowering his weapon. The threat neutralized, but the horror only beginning to unfold. The extraction was slow, methodical. The girls were weak, some unable to walk without assistance. They seemed paralyzed by fear, their eyes wide and vacant, tracking the movements of the agents, but offering no response, no resistance. Thorne watched them, the cold dread in his stomach solidifying into a grim certainty. This wasn't just trafficking. The depth of the trauma evident in their silence suggested something far worse, something long-term. They were transported immediately to a secure shelter facility in Nogales, a place equipped to handle victims of severe trauma. Thorne followed, overseeing the process, his mind already racing through the possibilities. In the sterile environment of the shelter, the preliminary examination began. The girls remained mute. They offered no names, no histories. They seemed to communicate only with each other through subtle glances and gestures. The driver, Villalobos, had lawyered up and wasn't talking. The ownership of the truck was buried under layers of shell corporations. Thorne looked at the 8 silent girls. Who were they? Where had they come from? He ran their descriptions and estimated ages through the missing persons databases. Thousands of names scrolled past. Nothing definitive, but the southwest border held its secrets, and Thorne knew the history of the region. He remembered the cold case file that had crossed his desk months ago, the one that seemed impossible. The St. Margaret's disappearance, 1995. 2 girls vanished near this very highway. It was a long shot, a wild speculation. Those girls had been 6 and 7 years old. These girls were teenagers, but 7 years had passed. He pulled up the St. Margaret's file again. He looked at the age-progressed images generated by forensic artists years ago. The resemblance was tenuous, speculative, but he had to make the call. He found the contact information for the primary family liaison, the mother who had never stopped pushing, never stopped calling. Elena Morales. The shelter facility was a whirlwind of controlled chaos when Elena arrived. The sterile scent of antiseptic couldn't quite mask the underlying tension that vibrated in the air. Uniformed officers conferred in hushed tones with plainclothes detectives, while social workers and medical personnel moved with an urgent yet gentle efficiency. Elena pushed through the double doors, her eyes scanning the faces, desperate for answers. Agent Thorne materialized from the crowd. He was tall, his presence projecting a methodical calm that seemed at odds with the turmoil swirling around them. "Mrs. Morales, thank you for coming so quickly." "Where are they?" Elena demanded, dispensing with any preamble. Her voice was raw, strained by the desperate hope, warring with the fear of another disappointment. "They're being evaluated," Thorne said gently, guiding her toward a quieter corridor away from the main flurry of activity. "I need to prepare you, Mrs. Morales. They are severely traumatized. They haven't spoken to us yet. We have no identification. I need to see them," Elena insisted. The adrenaline that had fueled her drive south was rapidly curdling into a sickening dread. What if this was just another mistake, another group of victims whose tragedy wasn't hers? "We're facilitating that," Thorne assured her. "But we need to proceed with caution, for their sake and for yours." He led her to an observation room separated from a larger common area by a wide panel of one-way glass. Elena approached the glass, her breath fogging the cool surface as she pressed her hands against it. Inside, the 8 girls were gathered. They had been cleaned up, dressed in identical gray sweatsuits that seemed to swallow their thin frames. They sat around a table, picking listlessly at the food provided. Their movements were hesitant, almost robotic, as if they were afraid of making a sound, of taking up space. Elena studied their faces one by one, a painful inventory of loss. They were older now, the softness of childhood brutally erased by years of hardship. Their eyes, too large for their gaunt faces, seemed haunted by experiences Elena couldn't begin to fathom. She searched frantically for a flicker of recognition, a familiar feature, the ghost of the little girl she had lost. Nothing. Her heart plummeted. The crushing weight of disappointment, so familiar, yet so acutely painful, settled over her. She had allowed herself to hope, and now the void was rushing back in, darker and deeper than before. Gabriella was not there. These were just 8 more broken children in a world full of them. They weren't hers. Tears blurred her vision, the sterile room dissolving into a watercolor of gray and white. She turned away from the glass, unable to bear the sight any longer. "It's not them," she choked out, the words tasting like ash. "My daughter isn't here." Thorne placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "We didn't know, Elena." "I'm sorry." She nodded numbly, gathering the shattered pieces of her resolve. It was time to go home, time to return to the empty rooms and the fading memories. As she turned toward the door, a woman in a white coat, a trauma specialist who had been inside the room with the girls, rushed out into the corridor, her face flushed with a sudden unexpected excitement. "Agent Thorne." "Wait." Thorne turned, his expression shifting instantly from sympathy to sharp attention. "What is it, Dr. Arrington?" She spoke, Dr. Arrington whispered, her voice trembling slightly, one of them. She whispered her name. Elena stopped, her hand frozen on the door handle. "What name?" Thorne asked, his voice tight. Dr. Arrington consulted the clipboard in her hand, her eyes scanning the list of names Thorne had provided from the St. Margaret's file. Rosa Alvarez. Elena's blood ran cold. "Rosa Alvarez!" She remembered the name, remembered the little girl with the bright smile and the long dark braids who had been Gabriella's best friend. She turned back to the observation window, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Inside the room, the atmosphere had shifted. The girls were looking at each other, a silent, profound conversation passing between them. "And the others," Dr. Arrington continued, her voice gaining strength, the realization dawning on her as she read the names. They followed one by one. They're naming themselves. She read the names from the list. Ana López, Teresa Jiménez, Carmen Reyes, Isabel Duarte, María Sosa, Clara Ramos, Julia Medina. 8 names, 8 of the 22. Elena stared at the girls through the glass, the reality of the situation crashing over her with the force of a physical blow. It was them, the missing children of St. Margaret's. They had been alive all this time. The relief was so profound it was paralyzing, but it was immediately followed by a terrifying realization, a question that ripped the breath from her lungs. If these 8 were here, where were the others? Where were the remaining 14? Where was Gabriella? The void hadn't been filled. It had just grown infinitely larger, infinitely more terrifying. The silence of 7 years had broken, not with a joyful noise, but with a scream of anguish. The news broke over St. Margaret's Academy like a sudden storm, shattering the quiet routine of the school. In the hushed sanctity of the chapel, Sister Agnes Delgado was kneeling in prayer, the familiar scent of incense and polished wood surrounding her when the Mother Superior found her. The words, "found alive." Nogales seemed incomprehensible at first, swirling in the air like the dust motes dancing in the stained glass light. Agnes had prayed for this moment for 7 years. Yet now that it had arrived, it felt less like a miracle and more like a reckoning. The guilt struck her next, a familiar wave of nausea that threatened to buckle her knees. The field trip to the historic mission near Nogales. It was supposed to have been her responsibility. She was the primary chaperone, but she had woken up that morning consumed by a raging fever, unable to stand. Sister Magdalena Cruz, her closest friend in the order, had taken her place without hesitation. Magdalena, who had vanished along with the 22 girls. Agnes had lived with the agonizing question every day since, a thorn lodged deep in her soul. What if she had gone? Would things have been different? Would Magdalena still be alive? She stood on unsteady legs, her hands trembling as she clutched the simple wooden cross around her neck. "How many?" she whispered, the question barely audible. "8, the Mother Superior replied, her voice grave. "The others? We don't know." Agnes knew what she had to do. The path forward was clear, terrifying, but unavoidable. She had to go to them. She had to face the consequences of her absence. She drove to Nogales, the familiar desert landscape blurring past. Her mind trapped in the agonizing loop of the past, the what-ifs echoing in the silence of the car. At the shelter facility, the atmosphere remained tense, the air thick with the unspoken trauma of the rescued girls. Elena Morales was there pacing the corridor outside the observation room like a caged animal, her energy radiating a mixture of fury and desperation. Agnes recognized her instantly. Elena had become the public face of the tragedy, the relentless advocate who refused to let the world forget. Agnes approached her hesitantly, the weight of her habit feeling heavier than usual. Elena. Elena turned, her eyes red-rimmed but blazing with a fierce intensity. She recognized Agnes too, the nun who hadn't been there. The silence between them was heavy, charged with unspoken accusations and a shared profound pain. "I had to come," Agnes whispered, the words feeling hopelessly inadequate. Elena studied her face, searching for something, her expression unreadable. "Why?" she asked, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "To seek absolution." The bluntness of the question struck Agnes like a blow. "No," she replied, meeting Elena's gaze, refusing to look away to help. "They might talk to me, they remember me." Elena considered this. The FBI interviews had been slow, painstaking. The girls were deeply traumatized, resistant to the authority figures who had failed to protect them. Maybe Agnes was right. A familiar face, a connection to the life they had lost might be the key to unlocking their memories. "They won't let me in there," Elena said, gesturing toward the observation room, the frustration evident in her voice. "They say it's too overwhelming for them." "Let me try," Agnes insisted, her voice gaining a quiet strength. Agent Thorne, recognizing the potential value of Agnes's presence, agreed. Elena and Thorne watched through the one-way glass as Agnes entered the room. The girls looked up, their expressions guarded, their bodies tense. But as Agnes approached the table, a flicker of recognition passed through their eyes, a subtle shift in the atmosphere. "Rosa," Agnes whispered, addressing the girl who had first spoken, her voice soft, gentle. "Do you remember me, Sister Agnes?" Rosa studied her face, her eyes wide and cautious, searching for the memory of the woman who had taught her to read, who had bandaged her scraped knees. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. The tension in the room eased slightly. Agnes sat down at the table, her presence a calming anchor in the storm of their trauma. The interviews began again, this time with Agnes leading the questioning, guided by the trauma specialists. The process was agonizingly slow, the girls' memories fragmented, buried under layers of pain and fear. They spoke in whispers, their voices monotone, devoid of emotion, as if reciting a story that had happened to someone else. They described the hijacking, the rented school bus stopping on the rural road. Men with guns, their faces obscured by masks. Sister Magdalena. This was the first time they mentioned her. The memories seemed to ignite a spark of emotion in their vacant eyes. They remembered her fighting back fiercely, desperately trying to protect them. They remembered her screaming at them to run, placing herself between them and the armed men. They remembered the men dragging her away, her habit torn, her cries abruptly silenced. They didn't know what happened to her. They described being taken to a holding location, a ranch. The sensory details were vague but vivid. The smell of dust and manure, the sound of dogs barking in the distance, the cold nights and the scorching days. They were held there for days, maybe weeks. They weren't sure. Time had become meaningless, a blur of fear and survival. And then the crucial detail, the split. They separated us, Teresa Jimenez whispered, her eyes fixed on the table, the memory unfolding in her mind. They took the others. The others? Agnes asked gently, her heart pounding. Who? Teresa listed the names. 14 names. A roll call of the missing, including Gabriella. The 8 of them had stayed at the ranch for years. They didn't know why they were kept while the others were moved. A random selection, a cruel twist of fate. Where did they take them? Elena urged through the intercom system, her voice tight with desperation. The girls shook their heads. They didn't know. A truck had come in the night. The others were loaded onto it, their cries echoing in the darkness. They never saw them again. The realization settled over Elena like a shroud. Gabriella had been moved deeper into the darkness, further away from the light. The fragmented memories of the 8 survivors offered a tantalizing glimpse into the abyss. But the fate of the remaining 14 remained shrouded in mystery. The investigation had a starting point. The ranch, but the trail of the others was already cold, vanishing into the vast, unforgiving landscape of the borderlands. The descriptions provided by the girls were a mosaic of sensory impressions rather than a concrete roadmap. The pungent smell of creosote after a rain, the distant rumble of cattle trucks on a gravel road, the silhouette of a distinctive craggy rock formation against the bruised purple of the desert sunset. These fragments, however, were enough for the investigators to begin the painstaking process of narrowing down the possibilities. Satellite imagery, topographical maps, and property records were cross-referenced. The digital search contrasting sharply with the visceral nature of the clues. The focus gradually centered on a cluster of remote ranches west of Nogales. Nestled in the rugged, unforgiving terrain near the border, Elena, fueled by a desperate urgency that gnawed at her insides, pushed Thorne to act. Every hour that passed felt like a betrayal, a missed opportunity. You have the potential locations. Why the delay? She demanded, confronting him in the makeshift command center set up at the Nogales FBI office. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and the hum of computers. We're building the case, Elena, Thorne replied, his patience strained but holding. He gestured toward the map spread across the table, a tapestry of grids and coordinates. We need ironclad probable cause for a warrant. We have to ensure we have the right location. If we go in prematurely and it's the wrong place, we tip our hand to the network. While you're waiting for ironclad, they could be moving evidence. They could be running. The frustration in her voice was a palpable thing. I understand your urgency, Thorne said, meeting her gaze. But we have to follow procedure. Elena had lost all faith in procedure. Procedure hadn't protected the girls 7 years ago. Her distrust extended to the local authorities. The Nogales Police Department had been involved in the initial investigation back in 1995, and Elena remembered their sluggishness, their dismissive attitude toward the frantic families. She noticed one officer in particular lingering on the periphery of the command center, a man whose presence seemed to cast a subtle shadow over the proceedings. Officer Javier Barrentos. He was older now, heavier around the middle, but the face was the same. He had been one of the first responders at the scene of the abandoned bus. She remembered his bored expression, the way he had seemed more interested in his paperwork than in the missing children. Now he observed the proceedings with a detached air that seemed practiced, almost theatrical. But Elena noticed the way his eyes tracked the conversations, the way he seemed to be listening intently, absorbing every detail. A cold suspicion, sharp and unsettling, began to take root in her mind. Thorne, perhaps sensing the same undercurrent of corruption, or perhaps simply recognizing the inherent risk of leaks in a small border town where loyalties were often divided, made a critical decision. The raid would be a multi-agency operation. FBI, State Police, and the Border Patrol Tactical Unit. Bortac, the Nogales PD, would be deliberately excluded from the operational details. A specific ranch, the Dos Alamos Ranch, was identified as the most likely location. It matched the topographical descriptions and had a history of suspicious activity flagged in intelligence reports. The raid was scheduled for the following morning in the obsidian darkness before dawn. "We'll notify you as soon as we have actionable intelligence," Thorne told Elena, the standard reassurance sounding hollow in the tense atmosphere. That wasn't good enough. She wouldn't sit by and wait for a phone call. Not this time. She and Agnes, now united by a shared desperate purpose, decided to follow the convoy. They waited in a darkened car parked near the FBI office, the silence between them heavy with anticipation. As the tactical vehicles began to roll out, silent and ominous in the pre-dawn gloom, Elena pulled out behind them, maintaining a discreet distance, her headlights off. The convoy headed west, leaving the city limits and entering the rugged, desolate landscape of the borderlands. The paved road turned to dirt, the terrain becoming increasingly treacherous. The dust kicked up by the vehicles hanging in the air like a shroud. They reached a ridge overlooking the Dos Alamos Ranch. Elena parked the car, cutting the engine. The silence of the desert was absolute, broken only by the distant cry of a coyote. Below them, the ranch was spread out, a cluster of buildings huddled in the valley, bathed in the pale moonlight. The lights of the tactical vehicles were visible as they approached the perimeter. Tiny pinpricks of light against the vast darkness. Elena raised a pair of binoculars to her eyes, her hands trembling. Agnes sat beside her, her lips moving in silent prayer, the rosary beads slipping through her fingers. The wait was agonizing. Every minute stretched into an eternity. The anticipation was a physical ache, a tightening in her chest that made it difficult to breathe. This was it, the place where the darkness had taken root, the place where Gabriella had been taken. Elena watched, her eyes fixed on the ranch, desperate to witness the outcome, terrified of what they might find in the heart of the desert night. The Bortac team moved with a lethal grace, breaching the perimeter of the Dos Alamos Ranch under the cover of the fading darkness. Agent Thorne followed close behind, the weight of his tactical gear familiar, his senses heightened by the adrenaline surging through him. The air was cold, crisp, carrying the scent of dust and anticipation. The ranch house was the primary target. The tactical team stacked up against the front door, their movements synchronized, the tension palpable in the silence before the storm. Breach. The command shattered the silence. The door splintered inwards under the force of the battering ram. The team flooded the house, their voices sharp, authoritative, moving from room to room with practiced efficiency. Empty. The house was deserted, but the silence felt recent, fragile. There was a faint aroma of coffee hanging in the air. A half-eaten meal sat on the kitchen table, the food cold, abandoned. The occupants had left in a hurry. The evacuation swift, professional, clear, the team leader shouted, the word echoing in the empty house. Thorne moved through the rooms, his frustration mounting, a bitter taste in his mouth. They had been tipped off. The leak he had feared, the corruption Elena had sensed, had materialized, allowing the shadows to slip away before the light could reach them. But the evacuation had been rushed, and the evidence of their presence remained. In one of the bedrooms, Thorne found what they were looking for, not the traffickers themselves, but the ghosts of their victims. Small carvings on the wooden bed frame, names, initials, a child's handwriting, tentative yet permanent. In the closet, a pile of discarded clothing, small sizes, the colors faded, the fabric worn, the remnants of lives lived in captivity, the silent testimony of the missing children. They were here, Thorne murmured, his voice tight. The confirmation bringing a mixture of relief and renewed urgency. The girls were here. The search expanded to the outbuildings. The barn, the stables, the storage sheds, all empty, devoid of life. But the K-9 unit brought in specifically for this purpose began to alert intensely behind the barn. The dogs, trained to detect the scent of death, whined and paced, their focus fixed on a specific area. The area was covered with fresh debris, piles of scrap metal, discarded tires, a layer of recently disturbed earth. A hasty attempt to conceal what lay beneath. "Here!" the handler shouted, pointing to the spot where the dog was digging frantically, the desperation in its movements, mirroring the dread spreading through Thorn. He knew what this meant. The grim reality of the situation settling over him like a shroud. "Get the forensic team here now," he ordered, his voice grim. The hope of finding more survivors fading with the rising sun. From the ridge, Elena watched through the binoculars as the sun rose over the desert, casting long, ominous shadows across the valley. The initial flurry of activity at the ranch had subsided, replaced by a slower, more methodical pace that spoke of discovery rather than pursuit. She saw the agents moving in and out of the buildings, the K-9 unit working the perimeter. And then she saw the forensic tents being erected behind the barn. White tents, the universal symbol of death, stark against the muted colors of the desert landscape. Her breath hitched. She lowered the binoculars, her hands trembling uncontrollably, the reality of the situation crashing over her. "What is it?" Agnes asked, her voice filled with dread, her eyes fixed on Elena's pale face. "They found something," Elena whispered, the words catching in her throat. Behind the barn, they waited, the silence between them heavy and suffocating. The sun climbed higher in the sky, the heat intensifying, the scene below remaining grimly active. Hours later, a vehicle left the ranch and headed toward the ridge. It was Thorn. He pulled up beside Elena's car, his face etched with fatigue and a profound sorrow. He got out and walked toward them, the dust kicking up around his boots, the sound of his footsteps loud in the silence. Elena met him, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, the fear of what he was about to say paralyzing her. "We found them," Thorn said, his voice low, the words carrying the weight of the tragedy. Elena searched his face, desperate for a glimmer of hope, a qualification, a denial. "Not alive," he clarified, the words falling like stones, crushing the fragile hope she had clung to. Elena closed her eyes, the world tilting beneath her feet, the abyss opening up before her. A mass grave. Thorn continued, his voice heavy with emotion. 7 bodies, small, consistent with the ages of the missing girls. 7. The number hung in the air, suspended between the past and the present, a testament to the brutality of their captors. And another one, Thorn added, his gaze shifting toward Agnes, his expression softening with sympathy. Separate, shallow grave. "We found this." He held out a small evidence bag. Inside a silver cross on a simple chain, tarnished but recognizable. Agnes recognized it instantly. "Sister Magdalena." She gasped, a strangled cry escaping her lips, tears streaming down her face. The guilt that had haunted her for 7 years finally found its release in a torrent of grief. The confirmation of her friend's fate, a devastating blow. Forensic analysis would later confirm the grim reality. Sister Magdalena Cruz had been executed shortly after the abduction. A single gunshot wound to the back of the head, a martyr's death. The 7 girls had died over the years. Illness, neglect, failed transfers, their bodies secretly buried at the ranch. Silent testimonies to the suffering they had endured. Elena stood on the ridge, the desert wind whipping around her, the vast emptiness of the landscape mirroring the void in her heart. 7 bodies, 7 more ghosts to add to the agonizing toll, but Gabriella was not among them. The realization brought a strange, twisted sense of relief, immediately followed by a renewed wave of terror. If Gabriella wasn't here, where was she? The darkness had not ended. It had only deepened, the trail leading further into the abyss. The process of identification was a descent into a sterile, cold hell. The forensic pathologist's office was permeated by the smell of disinfectant. A futile attempt to mask the odor of death, Elena, bound by her role as the primary family liaison, felt an obligation to be present, to bear witness to the agonizing confirmation of the fates of the 7 girls found at the ranch. One by one, the families of the missing children were brought in, their faces a roadmap of grief and terror. They had clung to hope for 7 years, and now that hope was being systematically dismantled. The evidence was presented with a clinical detachment that belied the horror it represented. Dental records, DNA analysis, the remnants of clothing and jewelry, the fragments of lives cut short, the irrefutable proof of their tragic end. Elena held their hands, offering what little comfort she could, her own heart shattering with each confirmation the shared grief a suffocating blanket that threatened to smother them all. But Gabriella was not there. The 7 victims were classmates, friends, the little girls who had shared Gabriella's laughter and innocence. They had died in captivity, their lives extinguished by the casual brutality of their captors. 7 girls remained missing. The agonizing uncertainty continued. The focus shifted back to the ranch. The scene of the crime, now a meticulously organized excavation site. The forensic team worked tirelessly processing the evidence, collecting every scrap of information, every fiber, every fingerprint. The ranch house, despite the hasty evacuation, yielded a wealth of information. The lives lived within its walls had left their mark. A trail of forensic breadcrumbs that began to paint a picture of the trafficking operation. But the most crucial discovery was made not by the forensic team, but by an astute analyst examining the structural blueprints of the house, searching for anomalies, for hidden spaces. A hidden cavity in the wall of the master bedroom concealed behind a false panel. Inside they found a ledger. It was partially damaged, the pages brittle and water-stained, but the contents were legible, the ink still dark against the aged paper. Codes, monetary amounts, dates, locations. It was the key to the entire operation, the roadmap of the darkness. Thorne's team began the decryption process, a painstaking task that required the expertise of forensic accountants and cryptographers. The silence of the command center was broken, only by the murmur of hushed conversations and the click of computer keys. The ledger revealed a sophisticated trafficking network, far more extensive and organized than they had initially imagined. It was linked to the northern Mexico cartels, a pipeline that moved children across borders like cargo, a conveyor belt of human suffering. The motive was purely financial profit. The girls were commodities valued for their youth and vulnerability. Their innocence a currency traded in the darkest corners of the world. Exploitation, illegal adoptions, a multi-million-dollar industry built on the shattered lives of children. The school bus had been an opportunistic target, a crime of convenience, a predictable route, lightly supervised near cartel territory. The perfect storm. The ledger also revealed the fate of the remaining 7 girls. They had been moved south, deeper into Mexico and beyond. The codes indicated specific locations, safe houses, transfer points, distribution hubs. The infrastructure of the trafficking network laid bare. The trail was international. The scope of the investigation had expanded exponentially. The local abduction now a global crisis. Elena studied the decrypted pages, the neat rows of numbers and codes representing the shattered lives of the missing children. The clinical detachment of the ledger contrasted sharply with the agonizing reality it depicted. She found Gabriella's designation, a series of numbers followed by a location, Honduras. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. Honduras, a world away, a place shrouded in violence and corruption, a country where the rule of law was a fragile concept, easily shattered by the power of the cartels. The trail was faint, obscured by time and distance. But it was there, a glimmer of hope in the overwhelming darkness, a path leading into the heart of the abyss. Elena looked at Thorne, her eyes blazing with a renewed determination, the grief momentarily eclipsed by the fierce resolve that had sustained her for 7 years. We have to go after them. Thorne nodded grimly, the weight of the responsibility settling on his shoulders. I know. But this changes everything. We're dealing with an international cartel network now. Jurisdictional disputes, bureaucracy. It's going to be a long, difficult fight. Elena knew he was right. The path forward was fraught with danger, the obstacles immense, but she also knew she couldn't wait. The ledger had given them a roadmap, a direction, and she would follow it to the end, no matter the cost, no matter the danger. The fight had just begun. The international trail, so clearly delineated in the ledger, dissolved almost immediately into a quagmire of bureaucratic red tape and jurisdictional inertia. The Honduran connection, the key to finding the remaining 7 girls, became a frustrating exercise in international diplomacy. Thorne's requests for cooperation from the Honduran authorities were met with silence, evasion, or vague promises of assistance that never materialized. The investigation stalled, trapped in the labyrinthian complexities of international law enforcement. Elena, however, refused to be deterred by the geopolitical obstacles. While the FBI focused on the complex ledger trail and the daunting task of navigating the international landscape, she turned her attention back to the local corruption she had sensed from the beginning, the rot that had allowed the trafficking network to flourish. The leak that had allowed the occupants of the ranch to escape still hadn't been identified. The sluggishness of the initial investigation in 1995, the incompetence that had allowed the trail to go cold still hadn't been explained. She and Agnes, driven by a shared sense of injustice, began the painstaking process of re-examining the 1995 case files. They were looking for inconsistencies, anomalies, the subtle signs of corruption that might have been overlooked in the initial chaos. They spent days buried in the archives of the Nogales Police Department, the air thick with the smell of dust and aging paper. They sifted through reports, witness statements, and evidence logs, the sheer volume of information overwhelming. The silence of the archives was oppressive, but the determination that fueled them was relentless. And then they found it, the thread that began to unravel the tapestry of deceit. Officer Javier Barrentos. The name appeared repeatedly in the initial reports. He had been one of the first responders at the scene of the abandoned bus, the officer responsible for securing the scene and coordinating the initial search. His reports were detailed, meticulous, seemingly thorough, but when cross-referenced with the evidence logs in the timeline of the investigation, the contradictions became apparent. He claimed to have secured the scene immediately. Yet the evidence logs showed that crucial evidence, fingerprints, fibers, the remnants of the children's belongings had been contaminated or lost. The scene compromised by unauthorized personnel. He claimed to have initiated a search immediately. Yet the timeline showed a significant delay between the discovery of the bus and the mobilization of search teams. The critical first hours wasted, the trail allowed to fade. The inconsistencies were subtle, easily dismissed as incompetence or the chaotic nature of the initial response. But Elena saw a pattern, a deliberate, methodical effort to obstruct the investigation, to sabotage the search. Barrentos was the shield, the corrupt element within the system that had protected the traffickers, allowing them to operate with impunity. Elena knew they needed proof. Suspicion wasn't enough to bring down a decorated police officer. They needed tangible evidence of his corruption. Feeling the FBI was moving too slowly on the local angle, their focus diverted by the international complexities of the case, Elena and Agnes decided to take matters into their own hands. They started following Barrentos. They were amateurs driven by desperation and fueled by adrenaline, operating on instinct and the fragmented knowledge gleaned from the case files. They learned the rhythms of his life, his patrol routes, his favorite bars, his home address. They observed him living a lifestyle that didn't match a police officer's salary, a new expensive truck, designer clothes, frequent dinners at high-end restaurants, the subtle signs of illicit income. They spent nights parked outside his house, the darkness their ally, watching, waiting. The boredom of the surveillance was punctuated by moments of sheer terror, the fear of discovery, a constant companion. One evening, their vigilance paid off. Barrentos left his house and drove toward the secluded warehouse district on the outskirts of Nogales, an area known for its illicit activities. Elena followed, maintaining a discreet distance, her heart pounding in her chest. He pulled into the parking lot of an abandoned warehouse. The windows boarded up, the walls covered in graffiti, a skeletal remnant of the city's industrial past. A few minutes later, a black SUV with tinted windows arrived, the engine idling. The occupants obscured by the darkness. 2 men got out. Elena recognized them from the FBI's organized crime database, their faces familiar from the mugshots she had studied, known cartel associates. Elena parked the car in the shadows of an adjacent building, the darkness concealing their presence. She pulled out a camera with a telephoto lens, her hands trembling as she focused the lens. She watched as Barrentos approached the men. The exchange was brief, professional, the body language speaking volumes. An envelope passed from the men to Barrentos. Money, a payoff, the price of his silence, his complicity. Elena raised the camera and began taking pictures. The shutter clicking softly in the silence of the night. The sound barely audible, yet deafening in the tense atmosphere. The proof they needed. The evidence that would expose the corruption and break the case wide open. The tangible proof of the betrayal that had cost the children their freedom, their innocence, their lives. Elena focused the lens, zooming in on Barrentos's face as he quickly thumbed through the cash in the envelope. The sickly yellow illumination from a nearby streetlight cast harsh shadows across his features, momentarily highlighting the avarice that had allowed the darkness to flourish for so long. She pressed the shutter button again, capturing the defining moment of his betrayal. And then disaster struck. The camera's automatic flash, a feature she hadn't realized was activated, engaged. A blinding strobe of light illuminated the darkness, a beacon signaling their presence. Barrentos looked up, his eyes widening in shock, then narrowing in recognition. He saw her. The connection was instant, the implications devastating. The two cartel associates reacted with the predatory instincts of seasoned criminals. They drew their weapons, their movements fluid and menacing, their attention shifting from the transaction to the threat. "Go!" Elena shouted, throwing the camera onto the passenger seat and slamming the car into reverse. The tires screeched against the asphalt, the sound tearing through the silence of the deserted warehouse district as she spun the car around. Gunshots erupted, the sharp reports echoing off the metal walls of the warehouses. The rear window shattered, showering them with glass, the impact throwing them forward. Elena floored the accelerator, the car fishtailing as she raced toward the exit, the adrenaline surging through her, overriding the terror. The black SUV was right behind them, its headlights blinding in the rearview mirror, a predator closing in on its prey. The chase was a blur of speed and survival. Elena weaved through the narrow streets, the SUV matching her every move, its superior power and handling evident. They were closing the distance, the gap narrowing with every turn. "They're going to ram us." Agnes screamed, clutching the dashboard, her face pale with terror. Elena saw an opening, a narrow alleyway between two buildings, barely wide enough for the car. A desperate gamble. She yanked the steering wheel, the car bouncing over the curb and plunging into the alley, the metal scraping against the brick walls. The SUV, too large to follow, screeched to a halt at the entrance, the occupants shouting curses into the night. Elena didn't slow down. She raced through the alley, emerging onto another street. But the car was damaged, pulling hard to the right, the steering wheel vibrating violently. The front tire, punctured by the impact with the curb, was flat. "We have to run!" Elena shouted, pulling the car to a stop, the engine sputtering and dying. They abandoned the car, scrambling out into the darkness, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the silence. They could hear the shouts of the men behind them, the sound of their pursuit intensifying. Getting closer, they plunged into the shadows of another warehouse, the vast space offering a temporary refuge. They hid behind a stack of pallets, the smell of dust and decay filling their nostrils. They held their breath, the silence pressing in around them, amplifying the sound of their pounding hearts. They heard the men searching, their voices muffled, their movements cautious, methodical. They were close. Too close. Elena gripped Agnes's hand, her knuckles white, the reality of their situation settling over her. This was it, the end of the line. They had overplayed their hand, underestimated the danger. But the men moved on, their footsteps fading into the distance, the silence returning, broken only by the distant sound of traffic. They waited, huddled in the darkness until the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, the gray light filtering through the grimy windows of the warehouse. They emerged from their hiding place, shaken but alive. They made their way back to their motel, the adrenaline receding, leaving behind a profound exhaustion and the chilling realization of their vulnerability. They opened the door to their room and froze. The room had been ransacked, drawers pulled out, mattresses overturned, their belongings scattered across the floor. A scene of violation, of intrusion, The case files they had been reviewing, the notes they had taken, the evidence they had compiled, all gone. A clear message, a threat, a warning. They were exposed, they were vulnerable. The shadows were closing in. Elena picked up the phone and called Thorne, her hands trembling, her voice unsteady. He arrived within minutes, his face grim, his eyes scanning the ransacked room, assessing the damage. He listened to their story, his anger simmering beneath the surface, a controlled fury directed not only at the perpetrators, but also at their reckless disregard for their own safety. "I told you to leave this to us," he scolded, his voice tight. "You could have been killed. You compromised the investigation." "But we got the proof," Elena insisted, handing him the camera, the tangible evidence of Barrentos's corruption. The photos were there. Barrentos, the cartel associates, the money. Thorne studied the images, his expression hardening, the realization of the implications dawning on him. "This is it," he murmured. "This is the leverage we needed. The key to exposing the entire network." He looked at Elena and Agnes, his gaze softening slightly, the anger replaced by a reluctant admiration for their courage, their determination. "You need to return to Tucson now. You're not safe here. They know who you are. They know what you're doing." Elena shook her head, the decision already made. "No, I'm not leaving. Not now. Not when we're so close." The ledger pointed south. The danger was now personal. The threat had galvanized her, solidifying her resolve. "If they're coming after us," she said, her voice cold and steady, the fear replaced by a fierce determination, "it means we're getting close. It means they're afraid." She looked at Agnes, who nodded in agreement, her face pale but resolute. "We're going south," Elena said. "The decision irrevocable. We're going to Honduras. The point of no return had been crossed. The Rubicon had been passed. The only way out was through into the heart of the darkness." The decision to pursue the trail into Honduras was a leap of faith into the abyss. But the logistics of the journey were a daunting challenge. They were operating outside the system, beyond the reach of the FBI's protection. They needed help. Sister Agnes became their lifeline. The Catholic Church, with its vast network and deep roots in Latin America, offered a pathway into the darkness. Agnes activated her resources, contacting her order in Nogales, Sonora, just across the border in Mexico. They arranged safe passage and a place to stay at a secure convent, a sanctuary from the violence that gripped the border town. They crossed the border disguised as lay missionaries, their faces obscured by wide-brimmed hats and sunglasses, their belongings packed in worn backpacks. The tension at the crossing was palpable, the fear of recognition, a constant companion. But they made it through, melting into the chaotic streets of Nogales, Sonora. The convent was a haven of peace amidst the turmoil. The nuns welcomed them with open arms, offering them food, shelter, and support. It was here that they met Father Anselmo, a local priest with a deep knowledge of the underworld.
He had spent years working in the slums, ministering to the marginalized and the forgotten.
And he understood the intricate web of corruption and violence that defined the border region. Elena shared the decrypted information from the ledger, the codes and locations that Thorne had provided before they left. Father Anselmo studied the pages, his expression grave. He recognized some of the locations, cartel safe houses, transfer points. "But this trail is old," he warned. 7 years the girls wouldn't have stayed here long. They would have been moved south to the main distribution hubs. He pointed to the designation in the ledger that indicated Honduras. San Pedro Sula, he said, the heart of the darkness, a city controlled by the cartels, the gangs, the corrupt officials. If the girls were taken there, finding them will be almost impossible. The reality of the situation settled over Elena like a shroud. The scope of the network was overwhelming. The danger was immense, but the ledger offered a glimmer of hope, a specific connection to a network specializing in international trafficking and illegal adoptions based in Honduras. "We have to try," Elena insisted, her voice unwavering. Father Anselmo studied her face, recognizing the fierce determination in her eyes. "I will help you," he said. "I have contacts in Honduras, people who fight against the darkness. But you must be careful. The path you are walking is paved with blood." He arranged their travel documents, false identities, and a secure means of communication. The journey south began a perilous trek through the heart of Mexico, following the faint trail left by the traffickers heading toward the epicenter of the violence. Honduras awaited the final destination, the place where the darkness had taken root. Honduras greeted them with a suffocating blanket of humidity and the palpable tension of a society living on the edge. San Pedro Sula. The city identified in the ledger was a sprawling metropolis characterized by extreme poverty and endemic violence. It was at the time one of the most dangerous cities in the world. The official investigation, hampered by international bureaucracy and the deep-seated corruption of the Honduran government, had stalled completely. Thorne's efforts to coordinate with local authorities were futile. Elena and Agnes were on their own. The reality of their situation was stark. They were two women in a foreign country hunting for ghosts in a city controlled by shadows. They needed professional help, someone who understood the terrain, the players, the rules of the game. They needed resources. The investigation had already drained Elena's savings. The cost of operating in this environment, bribes, safe houses, transportation, was astronomical. The desperate gambit began. Elena liquidated her assets. The house in Tucson, the small business she had built, all sold, the proceeds wired to a discreet offshore account. Agnes, leveraging the same network that had facilitated their journey south, secured funds from a discreet church charity dedicated to combating human trafficking. With the funds secured, they sought out the expertise they needed. Father Anselmo's contacts led them to Mateo Varga. Varga was a private security consultant specializing in extractions in Central America. He was cynical, expensive, and highly skilled, a former military intelligence officer. He had operated in the gray zones of international conflict for years. They met him in the lobby of the only secure hotel in the city, a fortified compound protected by armed guards. Varga was compact, muscular, with eyes that seemed to assess every threat, every angle. Elena laid out the situation, the ledger, the trail, the missing girls. Varga listened patiently, his expression unreadable. "This is a suicide mission," he said when she finished, his voice flat. "The network you're describing is controlled by the cartels. They own the police, the government, the streets. You go digging around, you disappear. Simple as that." "We know the risks," Elena replied, meeting his gaze. "But we have to try. These are our children." Varga studied her face, recognizing the same fierce determination he had seen in countless conflict zones. "My fee is $50,000, he said. "Half now, half upon completion. If you get killed, the balance is still due." Elena didn't hesitate. Done. The alliance was forged. The journey into the heart of the darkness began. Mateo Varga became their guide, their protector, their strategist. He navigated the treacherous landscape of San Pedro Sula, opening doors that would have remained closed to them, translating the language of the streets, the subtle cues and signals that define the underworld. The environment was volatile, dangerous. The presence of foreigners was immediately noticed, scrutinized. They moved cautiously, changing locations frequently using encrypted communications operating in the shadows. The search began, a desperate attempt to pick up a trail that was 7 years cold in a city where secrets were buried deep and the price of information was blood. Mateo began by activating his network of informants, a shadowy collection of former police officers, journalists, and low-level criminals who traded information for cash. He used the ledger data as a starting point, the codes and monetary amounts offering clues to the scope and scale of the trafficking operation. The trail was faint, obscured by time and the inherent secrecy of the underworld. The trafficking routes used 7 years prior had shifted. The players had changed. The alliances had fractured. They spent weeks chasing ghosts, following leads that dissolved into dead ends. The frustration was mounting, the exhaustion profound. The oppressive heat and the constant threat of violence wore them down. Elena, however, remained relentless. She pushed Mateo, demanding results, refusing to accept defeat. The breakthrough came not from the ledger but from the streets. Mateo located a former coyote, a human smuggler, who had operated in the region 7 years prior. He was now living in hiding, fearing retribution from his former employers. Mateo arranged a meeting in a secluded location, a dilapidated warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The coyote was nervous, his eyes darting around the dimly lit space. Mateo offered him money, protection, a way out. In exchange, he demanded information. The coyote remembered the group of young American girls. They had arrived in the middle of the night, escorted by armed men. They were terrified, silent.
He confirmed they were brought to a notorious conditioning facility run by the cartel.
A place where victims were broken, their identities erased, their spirits crushed. The facility was located near San Pedro Sula in a remote mountainous area controlled by the local gangs. The Coyote provided the location, a fortified compound hidden deep in the jungle. With the location confirmed, the next step was surveillance. They traveled to the mountainous region, the terrain becoming increasingly rugged and treacherous. The compound was located in a valley surrounded by dense jungle accessible only by a single dirt road. It was heavily guarded. Armed men patrolled the perimeter, their weapons visible, their postures menacing. The local gangs provided an outer layer of security, controlling the access road and monitoring the surrounding area. Mateo, Elena, and Agnes established an observation post on a ridge overlooking the compound hidden among the dense foliage. They conducted dangerous surveillance, monitoring the compound's activities, the comings and goings of the occupants, the routines of the guards. The surveillance was grueling, demanding infinite patience and unwavering focus. They spent days hidden on the ridge, enduring the heat, the insects, the constant fear of discovery. They observed young women inside the compound, moving between the buildings, their movements hesitant, their postures subdued. The facility was still active. The trafficking operation was ongoing, but they couldn't identify anyone. The distance was too great, the visibility too poor. They needed to get closer. They needed eyes inside the compound. The risks were immense. The danger was escalating, but the possibility of finding the missing girls, of finding Gabriella, was tantalizingly close. Days turned into weeks. The surveillance continued, yielding a detailed understanding of the compound's operations, but no confirmation of the identities of the young women inside. Elena began to despair. The hope that had sustained her for so long was fading, replaced by the chilling realization that they might be too late. The remaining girls might be lost forever. Their identities erased, their spirits broken. Mateo, however, remained focused, methodical. He knew that infiltrating a fortified compound was nearly impossible. They needed leverage, a weakness to exploit. He turned his attention to the guards. They were local men, poorly paid, their loyalty secured by fear rather than conviction. He identified a potential vulnerability, a guard named Luis, who had a gambling problem and a sick child. Mateo finalized a deal with him, a risky proposition brokered through intermediaries, the exchange of money for information. Luis was disgruntled, desperate. He was willing to talk. The information he provided was staggering. 2 American women were being held inside the compound. They were kept separate from the others in a secluded wing of the main building. They had been there for years. They were considered high value, their movements restricted, their contact with the outside world non-existent, and they were scheduled to be moved. The next night, their transfer was being handled with extreme secrecy. They were being taken to a new location deeper in the interior, beyond the reach of any potential rescue attempt. The urgency of the situation escalated instantly. This was their only chance. Luis confirmed the descriptions. They matched the age progression of the St. Margaret's girls. He also provided critical intelligence, patrol schedules, a security blind spot, a copied key card for the secluded wing. The plan began to take shape. A high-risk extraction relying on stealth, speed, and the insider intel. An official raid was impossible. The local authorities were corrupt, compromised. Any attempt to involve them would result in disaster. They had to do this themselves. Elena looked at Mateo, her eyes blazing with a renewed determination. "We go tonight." Mateo nodded grimly. The odds were against them. The risks were immense, but the opportunity was there. A fleeting window of opportunity that would close forever if they didn't act. The decision was made. The extraction was on. The final confrontation awaited. The weather turned that evening. A tropical thunderstorm rolling in from the Caribbean, unleashing a torrent of rain that lashed the jungle canopy. The thunder boomed, echoing through the valley, the lightning illuminating the landscape in brief, blinding flashes. It was the perfect cover. Mateo reviewed the extraction plan one last time. It was centered on timing, precision, and the intelligence provided by the insider, Luis. The window of opportunity was narrow, the margin for error non-existent. Elena insisted on going in with him. "I have to be there," she argued, her voice tight. "They're my children. They need to see a familiar face." Matteo resisted. She was a liability, untrained, emotionally compromised. But he also recognized the fierce determination in her eyes, the unwavering resolve that had brought them this far. He reluctantly agreed. Agnes would remain at the rendezvous point, a secluded location a few miles from the compound, serving as their lifeline, coordinating their escape route. They prepared their gear, dark clothing, night vision goggles, encrypted radios. Matteo carried a suppressed weapon, a last resort in case things went wrong. The approach was treacherous. The heavy rain had turned the jungle floor into a quagmire. The terrain slippery and unstable. They moved slowly, cautiously, the sound of their movements masked by the roar of the storm. They reached the perimeter of the compound. The floodlights cast long, distorted shadows through the driving rain. The guards huddled in their shelters, their visibility limited, their attention focused on staying dry. They bypassed the main perimeter security using the route identified by Luis. A blind spot in the camera coverage, a section of the fence hidden by the dense foliage. They cut through the fence, the sound of the wire cutters muffled by the thunder. They slipped inside the compound, the adrenaline surging through them. They moved toward the main building, keeping to the shadows, their movements fluid and synchronized. They reached the service entrance, the location provided by Luis. It was unguarded as promised. Matteo used the copied key card. The lock clicked softly. The door swung open. They were inside. The interior of the building was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of disinfectant and decay. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of the rain drumming against the roof. They moved silently toward the secluded wing where the Americans were held. The tension unbearable with every step. Elena's heart pounded against her ribs, the fear a cold knot in her stomach. But the determination that fueled her was stronger. They were close, so close. The infiltration had been successful. The extraction was within reach, but the darkness still held its secrets, and the night was far from over. The corridor leading to the secluded wing was long and narrow, the walls lined with reinforced doors. The air was cold, sterile. The silence was absolute. They reached the designated cell, the final barrier. Matteo positioned himself against the wall, covering the corridor. Elena approached the door. She used the keycard. The electronic lock buzzed, a green light flashing. She pushed the door open. The cell was small, dimly lit by a single fluorescent bulb. The air was stale, the smell of fear palpable. Inside, two figures were huddled together on a narrow cot. Elena rushed toward them, her heart leaping into her throat. They looked up, their eyes wide with shock and terror. They were young women, their faces pale and drawn, their hair long and unkempt. Elena recognized them instantly. The memory of the class photo, the innocent smiles of the 6-year-old girls superimposed over the haunted faces of the teenagers before her. Florencia Silva, Sofia Beltran. The relief was so profound, it was paralyzing. They were alive, but the relief was immediately followed by a crushing realization. Gabriella was not there. The void that had driven her for 7 years remained agonizingly empty. The finality of it hit her, even as she worked to help the girls. "We're here to help you," Elena whispered, her voice trembling. "We're taking you home." Florencia and Sofia stared at her, their expressions uncomprehending. They had been held in captivity for so long, the concept of freedom seemed alien to them. "We have to move," Matteo urged from the corridor, his voice tense. Elena helped the girls to their feet. They were weak, unsteady. They moved toward the door, their movements hesitant, robotic. As they stepped out into the corridor, they heard voices approaching. An unscheduled patrol rotation, a twist of fate. "Back!" Matteo hissed, pulling them back into the shadows of an alcove. They pressed themselves against the wall, holding their breath, the silence amplifying the sound of the approaching footsteps. The patrol, 2 guards armed with assault rifles, walked past them, their conversation muffled, their attention focused on the end of the corridor. They didn't see them, but as they passed the cell, one of the guards noticed the door was slightly ajar. He stopped, his expression shifting from boredom to suspicion. He approached the cell, his weapon raised. He pushed the door open. Empty. He reacted instantly, raising his radio to his mouth. "Alarma! Alarm!" The word echoed through the corridor, shattering the silence. Alarms blared throughout the compound, a deafening cacophony of sirens and flashing lights. The extraction had failed. The infiltration had been discovered. The fight for survival had begun. The compound went into immediate lockdown. The sound of heavy metal doors slamming shut echoed through the corridors. The clang of the locks sealing their fate. The planned exit route was compromised. "They've sealed the exits," Matteo stated, his voice remarkably calm. Despite the chaos erupting around them, his mind already racing, assessing the situation. "We have to find another way out." They were trapped. The guards were swarming the hallways, their shouts amplified by the sirens, their movements chaotic but determined. The net was closing in. Matteo led them down a side corridor, searching for an alternative escape route, a vulnerability in the lockdown protocol. They reached a dead end. A locked door reinforced impenetrable. He tried the keycard, denied. He cursed under his breath, the frustration mounting. They were forced to retreat, the sound of the approaching footsteps getting closer. The pursuit relentless. They found a utility closet, a dark, claustrophobic space filled with cleaning supplies and discarded equipment. They scrambled inside, pulling the door shut behind them, the darkness enveloping them. They huddled in the darkness, the silence pressing in around them, the air thick with the smell of ammonia and fear. They could hear the search intensifying, the guards moving methodically from room to room, their voices harsh, aggressive. They were close, too close. Elena gripped Florencia's arm, her knuckles white. The fear was overwhelming, paralyzing, but the need for answers, the desperate yearning for closure, was stronger. "Gabriella," she whispered, the name catching in her throat. A prayer whispered in the darkness. "Where is Gabriella?" Florencia stared at her, her eyes wide with terror. The question seemed to trigger a flood of repressed memories, a torrent of pain and grief that had been buried for years. In this moment of extreme terror, the truth finally emerged. A confession whispered in the silence. "She's gone," Florencia whispered, her voice trembling. "She died." The words hit Elena with the force of a physical blow. The world tilted beneath her feet, the darkness threatening to swallow her whole. "When?" Elena demanded, her voice raw, the pain unbearable. "Years ago," Florencia replied, tears streaming down her face, the memory of the loss still fresh. The confirmation of her deepest fear arrived at the peak of the crisis. The revelation shattered her, the grief threatening to overwhelm her. Florencia thrust a small object into Elena's hand, a woven bracelet made from colorful threads. The colors faded, but the craftsmanship intricate. "She made this," Florencia whispered. "Gabriella made it. She made me promise to give this to you if I ever got out." Elena clutched the bracelet, the tangible proof of Gabriella's life and her death. A connection to the daughter she had lost, a symbol of her enduring love. The grief was a physical ache, a tightening in her chest that made it difficult to breathe. The void that had driven her for 7 years was finally filled, not with the joyful reunion she had prayed for, but with the agonizing certainty of loss. The sound of the guards outside the closet door, the rattle of the handle, brought her back to the present. The immediate danger forced her to act, to compartmentalize the grief, to focus on survival. Gabriella was gone, but Florencia and Sofia were alive, and she had to save them. She had to honor Gabriella's memory by ensuring their freedom. The grief would have to wait. The fight for survival was far from over. Elena channeled the paralyzing grief into a cold, focused determination. She looked at Matteo, her eyes blazing with a renewed resolve, the sorrow transforming into a fierce strength. "Get them out of here." Matteo nodded, his expression grim. He was already assessing their options, formulating a new plan, his tactical mind working overdrive. They remained hidden in the utility closet, silent and still as the search continued. The guards were thorough, methodical. They checked every room, every hiding place, their frustration mounting as the search yielded nothing. They reached the closet door. The handle turned. Matteo raised his weapon, preparing for the inevitable confrontation, the burst of violence that seemed unavoidable. But the door didn't open. It was locked from the inside, a small detail that saved their lives. The guards cursed, rattled the handle violently, and moved on, their footsteps fading down the corridor. A stroke of luck, a fleeting reprieve in the chaos. Matteo realized the search was concentrating on the main building exits. The guards assumed they were still inside, trapped in the labyrinthian corridors of the compound. He signaled that they had to move. Now, while the attention was focused elsewhere, he had identified a weak point during the surveillance, a drainage channel near the outer fence line, a potential escape route, a path through the darkness. They slipped out of the closet during a lull in the patrols. The corridor momentarily empty. They moved through the shadows, avoiding the floodlights that swept across the compound. Their movements slow and agonizingly cautious. They made their way across the compound grounds, the rain still pouring down, masking their movements and sounds, the storm their ally. The distance to the fence line felt infinite. Every shadow seemed to conceal a threat. Every sound amplified the tension. They reached the drainage channel, a narrow opening in the concrete wall obscured by the overgrown vegetation. They crawled inside, the passage tight and muddy, the smell of decay overwhelming, the darkness absolute. They moved through the darkness, the sound of the sirens fading behind them, the chaos of the compound replaced by the suffocating silence of the underground passage. They emerged under the fence on the other side of the perimeter. They were out, but they were not safe yet. They were still deep in hostile territory, the jungle surrounding them, the threat of pursuit a constant companion. They plunged into the dense, dark terrain, prioritizing evasion over speed. The jungle was treacherous, the path slippery and unstable. They navigated the difficult terrain in the dark, the rain lashing down, the exhaustion profound. They reached the extraction point, the secluded location where Agnes was waiting, her prayers answered. She was there, the headlights of the vehicle cutting through the darkness, a beacon of hope in the storm. The relief was overwhelming. They scrambled inside the vehicle, shaken but alive. Matteo drove, pushing the vehicle to its limits, racing down the muddy road, away from the compound, away from the darkness. Elena sat in the back, clutching Gabriella's bracelet, the tears finally falling, a torrent of grief and relief. The escape had been successful. The extraction was complete, but the cost had been devastating. Matteo drove through the night, putting as much distance as possible between them and the compound. They reached a secure location by dawn, a safe house arranged by Matteo's contacts, hidden deep in the interior of the country. The safe house was a sanctuary, a place where they could finally lower their guard, where the constant threat of violence was replaced by a fragile sense of peace. Elena mourned Gabriella. The confirmation of her death brought a painful closure, the end of the agonizing uncertainty that had defined her life for 7 years. She sat alone, clutching the woven bracelet, the tangible connection to the daughter she had lost. The grief was a physical ache, a profound sense of loss that threatened to overwhelm her. But she was not alone. Florencia and Sofia, slowly emerging from the trauma of their captivity, shared their memories of Gabriella. They spoke of her bravery, her resilience, her unwavering spirit. They described how she had protected them, comforted them, given them hope in the darkest of times. They confirmed the fate of the other 4 missing girls. They had been trafficked elsewhere, deeper into the network. They had died over the years, their lives extinguished by the brutality of their captors. Gabriella had survived for several years, but ultimately succumbed to illness and neglect in 1999. Elena listened to their stories, the tears streaming down her face. The image of Gabriella, not as the innocent 6-year-old in the class photo, but as the resilient young girl fighting for survival, solidified in her mind. The grief was still there, a constant companion, but it was now tempered by a sense of pride, a profound admiration for the daughter she had never truly known. Matteo arranged safe passage back to the U.S. The journey was long, arduous but uneventful. They arrived in Tucson. The familiar landscape a stark contrast to the violence and chaos they had left behind. The reunion was held at a secure location, a private gathering of the 10 survivors and their families. The initial 8 rescued at the border and the 2 rescued from Honduras. It was a scene of profound relief and shared trauma. Tears of joy mingled with tears of sorrow. The families embraced their children, the years of separation collapsing in a torrent of emotion. Elena watched them, a bittersweet ache in her chest. Her own reunion had been denied, but she had played a part in theirs. Agnes stood beside her, her face etched with a mixture of grief and peace. She had confronted her guilt, honored Sister Magdalena's sacrifice, and found a measure of redemption. The silence of 7 years had finally been broken. The darkness had been exposed. The healing could begin. The rescue of Florencia and Sofia, combined with their testimonies and the intelligence gathered by Elena and Matteo, provided the leverage needed for decisive action. The international pressure on the Honduran government intensified, the exposure of the trafficking ring demanding a response. Agent Thorne, armed with the new evidence, spearheaded the investigation, his methodical approach now fueled by a renewed sense of urgency. The first target was the corruption that had protected the cartel in Arizona. Officer Javier Barrentos was arrested in Nogales. The photographs taken by Elena, combined with the financial records obtained through the investigation, exposed his long-standing relationship with the cartel. The evidence trail led to the exposure of the wider corruption network. Other officials, both local and federal, were implicated. Their complicity bought with the blood money of the trafficking operation. The arrest sent shockwaves through the border region. The exposure of the corruption shattering the illusion of security. International cooperation, once stalled by bureaucracy and corruption, was now unavoidable. A joint U.S.-Honduran operation was launched, targeting the compound near San Pedro Sula. The raid was swift, decisive. The tactical teams, guided by the intelligence provided by Matteo, overwhelmed the defenses of the compound. Key cartel figures responsible for the trafficking ring were arrested. Their reign of terror brought to an end. The network was dismantled, the pipeline disrupted. The flow of victims halted. The investigation continued, the complex web of the trafficking operation slowly unraveling. The fates of all 22 girls and Sister Magdalena were confirmed. The agonizing uncertainty that had haunted the families for 7 years was finally over. The St. Margaret's case was officially closed. Justice, long delayed, had finally been served. 1 year later, 2003, the scars remained. The wounds still raw, but the wounds had begun. Elena and Agnes, united by their shared experience and their unwavering commitment to the victims, established the Gabriella's Light Foundation. The foundation was dedicated to combating human trafficking across borders, supporting survivors, and advocating for the rights of the marginalized and the forgotten. Mateo Varga, his cynicism tempered by the resilience of the survivors, joined them as their chief security advisor. His expertise now dedicated to protecting the innocent rather than exploiting the guilty. The St. Margaret's case, a tragedy born of corruption and greed, became a catalyst for change. The exposure of the corruption led to significant reforms in border security and anti-trafficking protocols. The loopholes that had allowed the traffickers to operate with impunity were closed. The system strengthened, the defenses fortified. The silence had been broken. The darkness had been exposed. The legacy of the victims was one of hope, resilience, and the enduring power of the human spirit. The final scene. Elena stood at the memorial erected at the site of the Arizona ranch. A simple stone monument inscribed with the names of the 22 girls and Sister Magdalena. The desert wind whispered through the creosote bushes, the silence absolute. She touched Gabriella's bracelet. The colorful threads faded by time, but the memory of her daughter still vibrant alive. Her personal war was over. The grief remained a constant companion, but it no longer defined her. She had found a new purpose, a new mission. The fight against the darkness continued, but now she was armed with the light of truth, the power of memory, and the unwavering resolve of a mother's love.